Hello everyone, I'm Calabasas Mayor Pro Tem Fred Gaines.
And I'm Calabasas City Councilman James Bozajian.
And this is our 2012 general election recap show here on CTV, the Calabasas channel, the only place on television where you're going to get local analysis of the 2012 general election results, including Calabasas and the Conejo Valley results. James, let's start with the President of the United States, Barack Obama, reelected. Let me give you 3 quick points. 1, people did not dislike him. To throw out an incumbent president, beyond being upset about policies and things going on, I think they have to dislike you. They thought he's honest, they thought he's hardworking, they think he's a good guy. And on the other side, they had no problem with Romney, but he wasn't exciting. It wasn't like he was the new coming. And, you know, they didn't create a lot of excitement. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, the Romney campaign was actually pretty well run. After that first debate, was going in the right direction. And these 2 Senate candidates with the abortion comments that took over the national media, because what you saw at that point, you saw women, that gender gap in women starting to come back to Romney. People saying, you know, this guy's okay, he's not going to do anything rash. And then the Republican Party reminds those voters, we're still way out there on these women's issues. And sure enough, that gender gap goes back to 12, 13%. You can't overcome that. And 3, all politics is local. This race was won in turnout, in the machine that Obama had put together for years, getting ready for this campaign to get those voters out to vote in those key states. Not that Romney didn't try, but 2, 3, 4 times as many contacts and calls were being made by those Obama people to their voters. You know, Hispanic voters vote 70% for Obama. That's not a surprise that they vote Democratic that way. The difference is turnout for Hispanic voters used to be small. Now it's mirroring regular turnout, and that's a large number of votes for them to overcome. Those are my 3 points on why you saw what you saw in the presidential race.
I agree with you for the most part. I have a couple areas of disagreement and a couple areas I'd emphasize. First of all, the Electoral College was a very decisive victory for the president, no doubt. The popular vote was a 2-point spread, about 48%. And that is, according to the research I've done, the lowest that a president has ever been reelected with. In other words, no president's ever seen his electoral or his vote margin shrink in this kind of manner from 2008 to 2012 that Obama had. Another point that I haven't seen people mention is the polarization. In a close national election with the popular vote, you would expect states to be relatively close in their votes within the states, and that usually happens. This time, there were 20 of the 50 states where the losing candidate got less than 40% of the vote. That means there are huge sections of the country where there's a tremendous support for one candidate or one party, one ideology, and that creates great polarization nationally, I think, and does not help with the national political dialogue. I think the Republicans do have a problem in the areas that you discussed. I think with some of the extreme candidates that made really ridiculous remarks, and I think the Republicans are actually glad that they lost as well, because nobody wants them on the national stage repeating those remarks. The Republicans have to go beyond their current base. They have to reach out to Hispanic voters. It's a large voting bloc and growing and very influential in some of the swing states. George W. Bush was able to win re-election largely because he cultivated that, and he actually was not talking about negative things toward Hispanics and toward the minority community. He reached out to them, he was inclusive, and he actually increased his percentages such that he got over 40% of the Hispanic vote in his re-election efforts in 2004. You don't have to get a majority, but you can't go down below 30% like Romney did. He carried the Hispanic vote in some states like Florida and Texas in 2004. Bush did. Romney utterly failed to do that, and the results showed in some of these swing states. There is one area I do disagree with you on, though, and that is I do think there was some level of bias, not to the extent it was in 2008, but some level of bias in the media. That's been a continual problem. The Republicans complain about it all the time, and when election time comes around, they don't do anything about it. They're caught flat-footed. They complain about it, but there's no response when they get this, what I believe to be negative coverage from the media generally. But that being said, the president was reelected, and I agree with most of your other points.
Of course, there's bias in the media. The number one media outlet in the country is Fox News. It's basically an arm of the Republican Party and the Romney campaign. But again, it's turnout. It's getting those votes out, and that's what happened in this race, and that's what determined the race. People talk about, well, the storm came at the end, and Governor Christie said nice things about the president, and Romney ran that ad in Ohio with about the auto. By that time, half the votes were in the can. The Obama people knew that they had gotten their people out to vote. They knew that they were making multiple times the number of contacts in the key states, and that's why they were a little smug towards the end. Because now, having said all that, you talked about how close it was in the popular vote, and this election was still one incident away from going the other way. If you had bad job numbers for 1 or 2 months, if you had a stock market crash, if you had an international incident that didn't go well, this election could have swung the other way without.
It could, Fred, but just as long as we're talking a little bit about my perception of the media bias, Fox News aside, which is of course biased in the conservative direction, take a look in the past 4 years when you read articles about the economy. There's never a criticism of the incumbent president. It's always bad economy inherited, fair enough, but it's a slowly improving economy under the president. There really is never enough criticism on an objective level, from my perspective, of looking at the situation. And I think that does have a long-term effect on people. The Republicans haven't responded effectively to it. So the final point you made, which I thought was very interesting, and I also agree with, the thing about the early voting. The Republicans do complain about the fact that, well, the Democrats dominate the early voting, our voters go out on Election Day and vote. I'm perplexed as to why that is. If you see that one side's bagging all those votes early, why are you waiting till the last minute to get your voters out and relying on a get-out-the-vote operation on Election Day? Early voting is available to everybody, and the Republicans just haven't taken advantage of it.
Let's get to our local
Sure.
numbers. There's the country, and then there's the other planet
Yes.
called California, where all kinds of other things happen. And let's start with our voter registration. In a lot of ways, you would think, looking at the voter registration, Calabasas is a little miniature California. The numbers are almost exactly what you see statewide in terms of party and decline to state registration.
Yes, and if you look historically, Calabasas used to be, when we incorporated in 1991, it was a plurality Republican territory, and it voted heavily Republican in most elections. The Republicans have lost 16 points on the registration, 47% down to 31% in Calabasas. In California, if we have this show long enough, Fred, we're going to come to the day where the Republicans are in third place. They're going to slip behind the decline to state, which used to be, when I was growing up, it was a 5 to 10% of the population. It was almost unheard of to be declined to state or an independent. Now it's a quarter of the population plus. The Republican latest registration figures, which came out on the eve of the election, they slipped down to about 29%, and independents declined to state are 27%. I wouldn't be surprised to see the Republicans slip further unless they change course here significantly. And that's especially in California, we're talking about some of the minority outreach that needs to be done.
Let's look at turnout. Calabasas turned out higher than the state of California. Nationally, we had about a 70% turnout, down from 4 years ago where it was 77%, although still reasonable for a presidential election. California, where you had no contested presidential election, you had no contested Senate election, you had a whole mishmash of confusing propositions, only 52% statewide. Calabasas, higher educated area, 63% turnout.
This will go up a little bit because California is slow in counting its votes because of the late absentees and the provisionals, but you're right, we're going to wind up with a lower turnout than the national.
Let's go to how Calabasas vote in the presidential election.
Sure.
Calabasas, 55% for Obama, 43% for Romney. And here's where, while the registration reflected California, you can see definitely that California was almost 60% for the president. We were 55%. And Romney did better in Calabasas than he did statewide.
He did. And let me tell you a big difference in the Conejo Valley from the rest of the state between 2008 and this year. There was an improvement on the Republican side by about 5 percentage points nationally. In other words, from a 7-point Obama victory to a 2-point Obama victory in the popular vote. In California, it was a 4-point improvement for the Republicans. But it's not evenly distributed. In Calabasas, Romney's improvement over McCain's showing was 13 percentage points. And you have in Agoura Hills 11 percentage points, in Hidden Hills 15 percentage points, Malibu 12 percentage points, Westlake Village 13 percentage points. The Republican base out here came home, and they voted for Romney where they didn't vote for McCain. It permitted the traditionally more Republican areas of this community to vote and actually put Romney over the top in some of the local cities. I think that's a significant difference from the rest of California and some of the other bluer areas. Now, it's nothing to write home about. Romney lost Calabasas and he lost some of the surrounding areas, but he did much better.
Well, and economics matters. When you look at Democrats in Calabasas, especially declined states, they are going to go one way or another based on how they view the economy and what's going on. I think that shows why Obama was 62% 4 years ago, down to 55%, and those votes went straight over to Romney. U.S. Senate race, not much of a race in California. Nope. You didn't hear much about it, 61-39.
That's your basic Republican base for just coming out and putting a relatively unknown, not someone controversial or anything, but just an unknown name on the ballot against a fairly popular incumbent senator, and you see the 22-point gap there.
And Calabasas voting
exactly
almost exactly what the state of California was
doing. Let's take a look at the congressional race, because I found this one to be one of the most fascinating. I was telling you before the show, a few weeks before the election day, this race started showing up nationally as one to watch. And I was surprised that Waxman, was on a watch list, because it seemed to me he was safe. But look at these numbers. He won 54 to 46%. The rule of thumb is if an incumbent congressman falls below 60% of the vote, they're in danger as far as the future. He didn't meet that threshold at all. And in Calabasas, it was very evenly divided, 52% Waxman, 48% Bloomfield. A couple factors to consider. This is a brand new district that snakes from near the Ventura County line all the way down, hugging the coast to the Orange County line. It encompasses a lot more Republican areas than it used to, areas like the Palos Verdes Peninsula, areas out here that are more Republican than Waxman's used to representing. So they were not familiar with him. It's been a long time since he's been out on the campaign trail. It's been a long time since he's been in the community. He's a national figure. And Bloomfield is an independent who spent a ton of his own money trying to promote himself and market himself. And he almost pulled out an upset. Maybe not almost, but he came relatively close.
And, you were talking about what the Republicans California needed to do. Take a look at this Bloomfield campaign, because he ran moderate on social issues, conservative on fiscal issues, and he almost knocked off a 30-year incumbent congressman, Democratic congressman. That's the kind of model that the Republican Party in California, if they want to get back into relevance, needs to do.
Let's go to the House of Representatives, 26th District, which is just to the west of Calabasas. Strickland versus Brownlee, a district designed, tailor-made for a moderate Republican or a moderate Democrat. Even registration. Instead, we had a very conservative Republican and a very liberal Democrat who moved into the district during the filing period, face off against each other, and the result was pretty evenly divided, but it looks like Brownlee has won. Fred?
This is a big national Democratic pickup. This was Elton Galligley's seat. I mean, it's been redistricted, but basically it was his seat, longtime Republican congressman. And, James, it'll be interesting to see how Ventura County goes. We've always thought, okay, this is a Republican stronghold, but the Democrats keep moving west and and this is Julie Brownlee, a Santa Monica, very liberal our assemblywoman up till the recent redistricting, and she's the winner in that district.
This will maybe switch hands over time. Looking now to the U.S. House of Representatives 30th District, which is to the east of us, a member versus member, Democrat versus Democrat race between two long-term congressmen, Sherman and Berman, and in Sherman just whomping Berman by a 20-point margin. Fred?
Well, it's just unfortunate at how negative this got, at how much money was spent between two incumbents whose voting records would almost be 99% the same. But again, I'm back to my all politics is local. The one, Congressman Sherman, who was out here in the Valley every weekend, who was at every chicken dinner, who had shook every hand and kissed every baby, He's a big winner over Howard Berman, a distinguished congressman, nationally, internationally, 30 years in Congress, but who just didn't pay enough attention to the local politics.
I think the only congressional race in the country which involved assaultive behavior, from my observations, Fred. Let's turn to the California State Senate 27th District, which is our district. Fran Pavley, longtime state legislator and city council member from neighboring Agoura Hills, been an elected official off and on for about 30 years, Democrat, against political newcomer Todd Zink, a deputy district attorney and military officer. And you see there, again, this is a swing district. Registration is pretty even, slightly favoring the Democrats, but a diverse area geographically. And looks like Pavley's won by about a 6-point margin. Little broader in Calabasas, which is one of the more Democratic areas of this particular district, and which is also an area which has seen the Pavley name for the last few decades, as we mentioned. What are your thoughts on this, Fred?
Well, you know, this race and the Brownlee race, there was one of the new things this time was online registration. And you had a very large, over a million voters, 1.5 million voters, online registration, including, I think, 700,000 voters on the last day, 2 weeks before the election. Those tended to be younger voters. They tended to be Democratic voters. And to the extent that those voters turned out, you may have seen a push beyond the numbers we would have thought in a Pavley-Zink race. We would have thought it might be closer than a 57-43, or even a 53-47 on district-wide. That last push of new voters may have been the difference in those races.
One other thing, I mean, Zink is a political newcomer, filed in the last couple days, had very little name recognition and experience. I think he put up a spirited contest, but I think that the incumbency and the background of Pavley helped her significantly in this race.
I think that's true. Our assembly person here in Calabasas, in the new 45th district, Bob Blumenfield, really 62-38 district-wide, and really not challenged in any serious way by Kolsky.
Right.
And he's termed out. This is his last term in the assembly, so that assembly seat will be opening up in the next election. And I also, Blumenfield has announced that he's going to be running for Los Angeles City Council. So you're going to see some action in this district in the near future.
Let's turn to the propositions. Proposition 30 is a statewide proposition for a tax increase to fund education. And this was one of the most high-profile propositions on the ballot. The governor went out personally and campaigned for this. It went seesawed back and forth as far as whether it was going to pass. There were different predictions. Looks like it's passed by about 8 percentage points. In Calabasas, it failed. And one thing I looked at here, Fred, was that this tax was very unpopular, or less popular, shall we say, and failed in all the local communities surrounding Calabasas. And I couldn't help noticing that one of the reasons might be that it raised personal income taxes on earnings over $250,000, and it enacted a sales tax of a quarter cent for several years. It's going to generate a lot of money, it's about $6 billion, but not particularly popular locally, I think due to the economic demographics of the community, and that alone would probably account for that. Would you agree?
If you're going to put a tax measure on the ballot you want to pass, make sure it applies to a small percentage of the population and that lots and lots of people you can go to aren't going to have to pay it. Now, that's not completely true here because it also includes a sales tax increase that everyone's going to have to pay. But in the city of Los Angeles, 65% of the people voted for it. In Calabasas, Agoura, Hidden Hills, Westlake, where you have a fair number of people who do have household incomes of over $250,000, it was quite a bit less popular.
Okay, Proposition 31. Revisions to state and local government budgetary process. This is one that I think failed in large part because it was so difficult to understand. And voters don't like complicated propositions. This would essentially limit some budgetary processes at the local level. So I think smaller cities and people who are involved in their local governments really weren't in favor of this. But I think the main reason it failed was basically it was too complicated. And bureaucratic.
This was the California Forward, the bipartisan group, put forward some revisions. There were actually some very good revisions in here requiring you can't spend more money unless you identify where it's coming from or where what programs are going to get cut to be replaced. It pushed some of the requirements down to local governments. There were a lot of good things in here, but there was no money for a campaign. You didn't hear about it. It was very confusing. And you're right, people vote no. When they don't know what it is, when they are confused about it, they vote no. And we're going to see that in a lot of these propositions. Because I think the exact same is true, well, on 33, which is the automobile insurance, again, it was one where I don't think people really understood what it was, and the vote was very similar in terms of a no vote.
That's right. The 33 failed, and I think a lot of people were just wondering where it came from and what it would really do. It seemed like too good to be true that everyone's auto rates would be lower. Let's turn to 32, the limitations on state and local political contributions. This really was a dispute over what this proposition did. Its proponents indicated that it would prohibit unions and corporations from using their monies for political expenditures. In some ways it restricted it, particularly payroll deductions. Unions were stating what seems to be the case, which is that it would actually apply almost exclusively to unions. There was a very concerted effort by labor groups to defeat it, and it looks like they were successful, although again, probably because there are fewer union households in the Conejo Valley, it did a little better here and actually passed in some of the Conejo Valley communities.
There's no hiding this. This was an attempt to take the money out of the union coffers. And the unions came out, the Democratic Party and the Democratic politicians who end up receiving a lot of the money in those union coffers came out, and Calabasas, which is a Democratic city in terms of registration, mirroring the state, it pretty much mirrored the state. And how
a little less so. And if you look at some of the surrounding communities, like I said, the numbers were down. In fact, in Hidden Hills, Negura, and Westlake Village, it would have passed. 34 was the repeal of the death penalty. And I'm not surprised at all that the people of California said, no, we don't want to repeal the death penalty. There still is a majority of people who feel the death penalty is right, even when it doesn't work, even when we don't put anyone to death in California, and even when it costs millions of dollars for these appeals. But when you put the basic issue to them, I think a lot of people still feel that the death penalty is justified, and that's what I think you see here. Numbers are down here, I think, for two reasons in support of the death penalty. Number one, the proponents never made any moral arguments about the death penalty itself. It was purely a financial push, and we're in bad economic times. Secondly, the proponents outspent the opponents 25-1, according to the campaign reports that were submitted so far. There was no opposition to this, no organized opposition to this to speak of. I think if you ask people if they're in favor of the death penalty, you get a far more favorable response that yes, they are in favor of the death penalty. This was framed economically, and it was much closer, but I think at this point it's clear that California is going to keep the death penalty.
35, I think we can add to the list motherhood, apple pie, and we're anti-human trafficking because everyone's against it. And
numbers are pretty similar across the board.
So there's 3 strikes revisions. I thought this was interesting.
Yes.
3 strikes was very popular when it was put into effect. And frankly, since 3 strikes is in effect, and there's many other factors, crime is down. But I do think people started hearing stories, the pizza story, the guy whose 3rd strike was stealing the slice of pizza and now he's in jail for the rest of his life. There were enough of those where people said, we need to moderate this and we need to do that. And a lot of the DAs came out in favor of this. And so I think those factors led to an overwhelming yes on revising 3 strikes, even though there's still a pretty good hard-on-crime attitude out there in the public.
Yes, the 3-strike statute was written by people not well-versed in the law. It was an initiative that was put in front of the voters. And the legislatures tried to amend it several times to deal with these issues of inequity or perceived inequity, as you've mentioned. Never was able to compromise with all sides. This is a result also fiscally of housing all of those people. And the fact that many DAs across the state, including locally, have not been enforcing the 3rd strike provisions. This 3rd strike, the 3 strikes law will still remain. It will not apply to nonviolent or non-serious felonies if they're the 3rd strike. And the public pretty much went along with this. There's arguments against it, but the public, looks like the public, by a 2/3 margin, decided to revise the law.
Genetically engineered foods. People voted no. I think this is just one of those ballot box legislation where people, if they're confused about it, there were some ads about why is this exempt and this not exempt, and they just said no. Although, a lot of support for this, more support than maybe I thought it was going to get initially.
There's also a cost factor. I think people realize that this could have some cost implications if we're the only state that's doing it. I mean, you've got 50 states, and businesses pick and choose where they're doing business sometimes, and if there's a lot of regulation in one state, they're not going to come here, which is similar to another proposition we'll get to in a moment. With a tax increase to fund education, Proposition 38, which was in large part offered as a rival to Prop 30, it failed utterly. It looks like it got 28% of the vote statewide, only 24% in Calabasas, and the surrounding communities similar. This didn't even come close, Fred.
And, look, I hope the message gets out. You can have $50 million, but it doesn't mean you're going to win a proposition. I mean, this literally was the campaign by Molly Munger saying, here's a ton of money. I want to do this. I don't care where the governor is, where everywhere else is on these things. And I'm pleased to see that the voters rejected that. And in Calabasas rejected it even more handily than statewide. You'll notice that, I mean, only 24% yes for this, where that's half of what voted for the tax in Prop 30.
Correct.
So people were able to identify, and a lot more people were willing to say that they're going to pay some tax for schools under the right circumstances, and Prop 38 was not that circumstance.
Prop 39 involves more additional regulations on multi-state businesses, not giving them tax breaks where they can pick and choose. They have to pay California taxes. I think this was seen by some of the more conservative communities, as you see from the numbers here, as being regulative of business and potentially scaring off some businesses. So the numbers dropped. But overall, it did pass in California 60% to 40%. One of the reasons I think it got big numbers, it was very cleverly combining very popular, hey, this is all about the environment. This is going to be an environmental issue proposition. And once they added that, it added a lot of potential voters to vote for it who liked the environmental provisions and kind of glossed over some of the implications it might have financially for businesses. We'll see if it has an adverse impact on businesses. It could potentially.
Prop 40, hardly worth talking about. The proponents themselves dropped out of the race and said, we don't really care what happens. That was the redistricting of the Senate seats. It had already been upheld in court, and the voters upheld the Citizen Commission Senate districts.
Let me end by my comments by just stating something about California. We talked earlier in the show about the polarization nationally. After this election, we're one of the most heavily Democratic states in the country. All of our elected officials are Democrats at the statewide level. Republicans have a problem breaking 40%. The highest percent gotten by a Republican recently in a statewide race is 46%. That's the highest in 2010. Our legislature is now about 2/3 Democrat. The congressional delegation's 2/3 plus Democrat, and it is just pretty much become a one-party state. And I think until the Republicans address some of the issues we discussed, it's going to continue to be that.
One final comment from me, this was our first election under this open primary where you had Dems against Dems in the final, or Republicans against Republicans. We had 28 of those races throughout the state of California. And the idea was that maybe the more moderate Democrat in a Democratic district would be the winner. And we saw a little evidence of that. We're going to be sending a few of those, a handful of those types of winners to Sacramento. And we're looking to see, is that going to make a difference? Can that help break the logjam? Can that help bring some bipartisanship to and some moderation to these to the discussions that we've had in the state that have been so polarized?
It'll take a few cycles to see, and also if the Republicans do fall below 1/3 in each house and perpetually remain there, it almost becomes irrelevant.
James, as always, it is so much fun to do this with you.
Yes.
And to bring this show to the viewers of CTV, the Calabasas channel. I'm Mayor Pro Tem Fred Gaines.
I'm James Bozajian, City Council member.
Thank you, and we'll see you during the next election.